which is what all the esoteric traditions say, and is where the idea of magic comes from in the first place. You can manipulate reality. If you go into a state of subjectivity where the difference between subjective and objective completely dissolves. Today's science, even today's philosophy to a large extent, and certainly at an everyday level of awareness, that sounds crazy, but that's where the evidence is pointing, both historically, anecdotally, and the bits of science that we know. Somehow reality is composed of mind and matter at the same time, and they are interacting all the time.
What's up, guys, and welcome to another mind and heart opening conversation on Just Tap In. I'm your host, Emilio, and today, get ready for a magical ride with one of the leading scientists and researchers on all things psychic phenomenon. For thousands of years, we've heard stories of mystical humans who developed special powers, and these stories are embedded in folklore, in Hollywood, ancient scriptures, you name it. And Dr. Dean Radin, our guest for today, has been a pioneer in the field of parapsychology, meaning for 40 years he's been studying exceptional experiences and abilities, commonly known as psychic. His work became so groundbreaking that he was asked to join as a scientist on a then secret US government program now known as Stargate. He later joined the Institute of Noetic Sciences as Chief Science Officer, where him and his team are probing into the nature of consciousness. As a highly inquisitive mind, Dr. Dean has written 4 best-selling books, the latest called Real Magic, which took a deep dive into esoteric traditions and how the modern human is deeply in relation to magic. He's been invited to talk to over 600 top organizations, including Google and the US Navy, and his 100+ academic articles have ended in the most notable and credible scientific journals. I know that there may be many skeptics out there, and as always, I trust that we are all here to expand our mind and to listen with an open heart. In my view, Dr. Dean is amongst the most courageous scientists who is willing to put his reputation on the line within the scientific community and truly act as an explorer, which is the only way that humanity is going to move forward. So with that said, if you want more conversations that are on the cutting edge of human potential, make sure to subscribe to this channel for more conversations with the leading experts in their field, and drop a thumbs up on this video right here to help the message get spread even further. And now, we welcome the modern day Professor X from X-Men, Dr. Dean Radin. All right, Dr. Dean, welcome to the podcast, brother. How are you?
Thank you. I'm doing well.
Awesome. There's so many different ways that we can start this conversation. Your research spans across all psychic phenomena, these experiences of the human nature that for centuries humans have been experiencing, and not until now are we attaching that with science. But one thing I wanted to start off with is, I know as you were a little kid, they would ask you, what did you want to do when you were older? And you said, I want to be jet propelled. And, that's an interesting answer for someone so young to say that. And I wanted to ask you, just to start off, what does being jet propelled mean for you? And how are you doing that now in your work?
Well, when I was asked that when I was 4 years old, I was probably referring to cartoons of characters that had jetpacks. And so I wanted to fly, right? What kid or even adult doesn't want to fly? So later I was thinking, when this would come up again, that people had asked, well, what do you mean by that? I would say that as from a child's perspective, it was a sense of freedom. Essentially, you're not bound by gravity. You can have a larger sense of what you're capable of doing. So translating that then into a scientific career, part of it is that I don't want to be constrained, among other things, by theory, because theory is extremely valuable in that it gives us an explanation for how things work. but it also acts as blinders. So some of my colleagues are theorists, and they develop a theory of everything or a theory of this or that. And very quickly, I see that they begin to view the world through their theory, and everything has to either fit the theory, and if it doesn't fit, they ignore it.
Yeah.
Well, that doesn't make any sense to me because the world is vast and our theories are tiny. So the sense now of being jet propelled is to be propelled beyond theory, pay a lot of attention to actual data and experiences, and see how far we can push it up to the point where we need an explanation. And at this point, I don't think we actually do, especially for psychic phenomena. We're still trying to understand the character of these phenomena. Theories can come later.
Yeah, you said in one of the research studies is that over 90% of scientists and researchers have reported having psychic phenomenon. That's 90% of the population. I just want to highlight that. And there's this resistance in the scientific community to fully accept all these concepts. And I just wanted to give people a little bit of a background intro about. So psychic phenomena is obviously an umbrella, and there's different aspects within that. What are some of the things that you have been studying within the psychic phenomenon? Some people might call it paranormal. I know you don't like that using that word, but what are some of those things that you're studying and looking into right now?
Well, keep in mind that all of these studies begin with experiences that people report. And the labels that we give to them are a way of talking about those experiences. So a word like telepathy is a catch-all phrase, meaning that what one person is thinking or experiencing, another person at a distance will have similar thoughts, usually around the same time, or similar experiences. So a wide range of telepathic-like experiences, some of which are conscious and some are unconscious, like looking at correlations in physiology between two people who are separated, or brain waves. All the whole body itself can correlate between people at a distance. So that's telepathy. Clairvoyance is the ability to perceive that is not bound by space or time. So when it's not bound by space, it means that you're able to either see something that is hidden or something at a far distance that you can't literally see with your ordinary senses. And the transcending time element is labeled precognition or retrocognition. So if you perceive something that hasn't happened yet in the objective world, it's precognition. And that too can be conscious or unconscious. And if it's something that happened in the past, it would be retrocognition. And that too can also be conscious or unconscious.
Although that one's different than memory, right? The retrocognition.
Well, yeah, if you're remembering something, that's memory. If you're perceiving something that you were not aware of before, like the reports of people, for example, going someplace and then suddenly having a very strong memory of something that happened there, but people that were being perceived at the time were in period costumes that were clearly a century ago. So just an experience that comes out of nowhere.
Yeah. So that includes like the past lives aspect of it.
It could. Of course, retrocognition is more difficult to test than precognition because you don't, except in exceptional cases, you don't actually know that the retrocognition was a real thing. Yeah. Right? Unless you can look up historically and discover it. And that occasionally does happen, but it's unusual to see that. So not too many studies are done using retrocognition as a task. And then, so those are three categories. The fourth category is psychokinetic effects, sometimes also called telekinetic. And it's the idea that mind and matter interact directly. In each one of these classes, there's between a half a dozen to a dozen different kinds of ways that these phenomena can manifest, and an equal number of ways that they've been tested in the laboratory. So we know pretty much across the board that there's a wide range in which you can think of this as ways in which information flows in the body and out of the body, or in the mind and out of the mind. So if information is flowing in, well, this is telepathy and clairvoyance and precognition. We're somehow getting information from the world. If we're pushing information back out, then we can think of it as a psychokinetic effect. And the reason I say that is because the way that psychokinesis is generally portrayed is things like bolts of lightning shooting out of your hands. It's like force getting pushed out. And we have never found any evidence that that is, in fact, what's happening. It looks much more like what's happening is that information is being exchanged. And so this is relatively recent within science of thinking about the forces and fields and those kinds of concepts, which make a lot of sense in classical physics. Once you get beyond that into quantum phenomena, we're not dealing with force anymore or energy in the usual sense. We're dealing more with the way that we describe how things are, which is informational. So I think, and many of my colleagues are beginning to think that ultimately all of the psychic phenomena are a kind of an informational phenomenon.
Yeah. I would like to share one of my stories, personal stories that I've never shared on this podcast, but it was really interesting. It's something that happened to me, and I know we humans, we learn by storytelling, and I would like to share this and then have you break it down from the scientific perspective from what happened. A couple months ago, around November of 2021, let me just give some context. When I first started this podcast, I created a list of guests and thought leaders that I wanted to interview, that I desired to interview. And, it wasn't until I felt completely worthy of having that and setting the intention, focusing the awareness, that I started reaching out and I started booking a lot of interviews. And one of those guests that I had been highly influenced by and I was highly impressed with his work was Dr. Joe Dispenza. A colleague. He's also studying all these mystical concepts. And one day I just got this like intuitive spark of, send them an email. So I went drjoedispenza.com and I contacted us on that form, filled out the form, wrote an email, basically channeled it. Like I was in this deep state of awareness and just like, it was like 2 a.m. when I wrote that email. And I sent that email and I kind of just forgot about it. And a month later, I was just checking my email, not even with any intention of like, I'm waiting for a response. I just went in the email and I got the response from his team saying, yeah, we would love to do this interview. I was shocked, and immediately I called one of my best friends, one of my friends at the time, who he was so interested, and he had been to like 7 Dr. Joe Dispenza retreats, and he was deep into the work. So I told him about it. And for some reason, I was in Mexico at the time. I bought a ticket to California because I was going to go visit some friends. And I didn't buy a flight back to Colombia, where I live. For some reason, I didn't buy that flight back. I never do that. I always buy the, two-way ticket. I just bought a flight and I was like, when I get there, I'll buy the flight back. I didn't really have a fixed agenda when I was going to California. So my friend gets on the phone and I tell him about it. He's like, where are you going to do the interview? And I said, no, well, we're going to do it in Zoom. This is how we normally do the interviews. And he's like, bro, I don't know why I'm telling you this, but I have a feeling you should ask them to do the interview in person. And I was like, well, as soon as he said that, I got a message on my phone. I looked at the message and the time was 3:33. And I was like, I just felt like tingles in my body. And I opened my WhatsApp and you can see how long the call had been going on for. And it was 33 minutes, 32 seconds, and 33 seconds right when I opened my phone to check the WhatsApp. So I was just getting all these confirmations. My body was like shaking, tingling. And all of a sudden I got an image of me interviewing Dr. Joe in person and like immediately flashed back to the moment. And I was like, yo, I think this already happened in the future somehow. And that same day I wrote them an email. I asked, hey, what's the possibility that we can make this work in person? And they responded the same day. They said, yes, we can make it happen. And that was one example. I just wanted to give like my experience of what I believe now is like a precognition or divination or something along those lines. And I would love if you could break it down for people of like what actually happened during that experience that I had.
Well, that's a classic synchronicity, right? It is a coincidence in time, but it's a meaningful coincidence. And in many ways, what we do in the laboratory is we create synchronicities, which is almost a contradiction in terms, because the whole point about a coincidence is that it wasn't caused. Yeah. Except that a synchronicity is a correlation. There's two things have happened that are correlated in time, but they have very significant meaning to it. And so when we do a telepathy experiment in the laboratory, we are in essence creating a synchronistic event, but we're creating it. So it's not exactly the same as coincidence. We have a correlation, a coincidence in time of things happening, but we made it happen. So one of the things that people believe about the notion of intention is that the intention can craft a meaningful coincidence. You can cause a synchronicity to occur. And this is very difficult to understand from any scientific perspective, because in science, you're always looking for what's the causal mechanism. How, when you begin to pull it apart, well, how did your intentions make that happen? And the answer is we don't know. We don't know how that happens because we don't understand enough yet about the nature of consciousness to know how it happens. But nevertheless, that seems to be what is happening, that there's something about a desire that manipulates something in the world that causes these synchronicities to occur. Yeah. So I'll give you one that happened to me recently.
Yeah, awesome.
So let's see. I have it here. So I'm also chairman of a biotech company, and as chairman, part of my job is to raise money to keep the company going. So we recently closed a funding round, but we decided that the investors and the people in the C-suite would meet together on Zoom, and then we would use DocuSign to sign documents that would seal the deal. So we decided that during our celebration online, that we would all hit the button at the same time, like we'd all individually sign these things on DocuSign and it closed the deal. So I happened to be driving at the time. My wife was driving, but I was the passenger. And so just as my fingers over my iPhone about to touch the thing to sign it, my wife says, "Oh, look, the license plate of the car right next to us. Have faith."
Have faith.
So this is not the actual license plate. It's one that we got as a replica. As a kind of it's a synchronicity, right? We see license plates all the time, but not one just at the moment that becomes meaningful. You need to have faith that this is going to work, right? So we closed the seed round, we got the money, and we're off and running. But nevertheless, those kinds of events seem to be revolving around the notion of very high intention. In this case, the intention of a group. Yes. We all wanted this to happen, and part of it then is, kind of having faith that it's going to work.
And that draws specifically to the realm of what we would call magic nowadays. Right before this interview, this weekend I was watching again the Doctor Strange movie on Marvel, the most recent one, and I've always been fascinated by superheroes. I just finished watching the Avatar, where they manipulate elements and you manipulate water and fire, air, earth. And one of the things that you said in your book, Real Magic, which I've literally recommended to some of my close friends that are also interested in this. So you said that in a lot of these field consciousness studies, it suggests that rituals are designed to draw and focus your attention on something. And if you do it as a group, you produce what you call the psychological sense of group coherence. And that group coherence is literally distorting the fabric of reality, of space and time. Can we go a little bit deeper into what that means?
Well, so the notion is that any kind of ritual will focus your mind. If you are working with a number of other people and you are coherent with each other, like each person is thinking along the same lines and not one of them is really is secret super skeptic who thinks it's all nonsense. You really do have to be in alignment. But if that alignment occurs, then there's some evidence that the larger the group, up to some size, it's not entirely clear what that size is, between 7 and 9 people, something like that. Up to that point, it seems to compound that whatever the intention is, it gets stronger somehow. So we know from a lot of laboratory studies that one person and one physical object, usually a random number generator, that one person's intention and attention will change the probabilistic output of the generator. So it's a mind-matter interaction at a very subtle scale, but nevertheless, we see it happen.
So the random generator is like, it's a simulated mechanism that gives you 50% probability of an outcome.
Yeah. So here's an example. This is a very fancy one that's based on the direction that a single photon of light will go either directly through a half-silvered mirror or bounce off.
Yeah.
And the decision of what the photon is doing is considered to be fundamentally random, meaning no cause at all. Well, Einstein didn't like that idea. That's why he said God doesn't play dice with the universe. He figured there must be some cause, but the prevailing idea in quantum mechanics is that there's no cause at all. So you take devices like this that produce sequences of random events, zeros and ones, that are unpredictable by any means. And so these are convenient to use in the laboratory because it's easy to collect the data on a computer. And then you assign somebody a task where they're looking at a graph on a screen or looking at some kind of feedback to produce more ones or produce more zeros. People can do that. Not everyone can do it to the same extent, but this lot of data has shown that this in general happens. So you can think of this as our intention is pushing the probabilities of the world around. How it does that, we don't know, but that's what happens. So a lot of the studies that have been done then in looking at this is, first of all, to verify that it actually occurs. The second is to try to begin to piece apart what are the criteria, what are the processes involved in making it happen. So we look at things like personality and physiology of the person, various different kinds of random number generators, other kinds of physical targets that have some degree of randomness in them because everything physical does. And a very, very broad range of targets then have been used as objects of intention. And as best as I can tell, anything that is measurable, like if you take, like most things, you can measure something about it, but if you take something like a rock or just a hunk of metal, it's difficult to know what are you going to measure on that. So, and those are generally not used as targets, but anything that is labile, that is living or is moving in some way, many have been used as targets, and virtually all of them show similar effects. So you have intention aimed at something, the something will change, usually in quite a subtle way, but in a measurable way.
Yeah. And for people that want this like 1, 2, 3 step process of performing magic, what would you tell someone that, you know, they have something in their life that they want to create, whether that's a relationship, whether that's a new job opportunity, whatever it is, more abundance in their life? What would be a magical ritual that you would offer for people to maybe explore or that they can do? And maybe some precautions as well.
Yeah. So one of the easiest ways is a sigil. So a sigil is a word that means symbol. And you think of a phrase that encapsulates what it is that you want. You take the first letter and you write those letters down, and then you move them around to create a shape, some kind of symbol that stands for your intention. And then there's lots of different things you can do. You could create that picture.
If I wanted to manifest a conversation with Dean Radin, would this be a good example?
Yeah,
I'm
that's an example.
If you're on audio, you can tune in on YouTube. I just drew a little symbol that it's called a sigil. Yeah,
and so that you can find apps on phones where you type in something and it'll create a sigil for you. I don't recommend that as much as actually taking the effort to do it yourself, and to be creative about how it looks. And for some people, they like it to look pleasant to look at or meaningful in some way, because you're using your intention in the process of doing that. So once you create the sigil, there's several things you can do. One approach is to make copies of it and paste them all over the place so that you're constantly reminded that you made this thing.
Get it into your subconscious.
Yeah. Yeah, like put it on your mirror that you see in the morning, things like that. So you're reminded of this. Mm-hmm. The conscious part of it is creating the sigil itself and so-called charging the sigil with that intention. And you don't want to dwell on it too much, because none of this happens through your conscious awareness. It happens once it becomes really deep into your unconscious. So you spend a fair amount of time making the sigil, thinking about it, and then you set it aside. I mean, it still could be up on your mirror, but you're not looking at your mirror all day long. Yeah. So you don't dwell on it. You set it out there and just let it go. You also don't need to think about how your intention will manifest, right? I'll give an example here if I can find it. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So one of the examples I give is you have an intention to get a gold-plated Mercedes. And so you don't care how that happens. You just want it to show up in your driveway, and you are the owner of this gold-plated Mercedes. Well, if you start thinking about what needs to happen in the real world for that to occur, you'll stop yourself immediately. Yeah,
that's what we would call like the linear thinking.
It's not only linear thinking, but it's self-questioning. You inject doubt into the intention, and that destroys the intention. So you need to intend this and say, look, I don't care how this is going to happen. I just want this to happen. Universe, you figure it out somehow.
Have faith.
Yeah, have faith. This is going to work. And it may work tomorrow. It may make 10 years to have it happen, but it'll happen. So I said this once on a podcast, and a person listening is a person I know is a witch who does this sort of thing all the time and comes from a long family of people who did this kind of witchcraft. Yeah. And so she sent me this, which is a gold-plated Mercedes. It actually is a little Mercedes car. Yeah. And she said,
Dr. Dean is showing a toy gold-plated Mercedes.
Yeah. She sent it and said, well, one of the things you didn't specify in your intention is that this is an actual car that you could drive. And so I did get my gold-plated Mercedes. It wasn't the one, because I didn't specify that. So one of the lessons in that is that when you have your intention, has to be absolutely crystal clear,
very specific,
about what you mean by that. And I have found again and again in my life that when I had a very strong intention about something, the clearer the intention was, two things would happen. First of all, it would happen, but the faster it would happen was related to how clear it was. So very clear intention, I need this for what I'm doing, just seems to appear.
Yeah.
So the flip side of all this is sometimes if you look at a grimoire, which is a book of spells used in traditional magic, a huge section of that is going to be on love magic. So it's to find somebody for love, for sex, for relationship, whatever. That is a gray area, because if you override the free will of somebody else, that's considered black magic.
Yes.
Black magic is considered not a very good thing because of something like karma. That you override somebody else's free will, you are opening a door that you don't want to go through. So this is like every tradition has this same warning. So you have to be clear, even in something like a gold-plated Mercedes. Well, was it stolen from somebody? I mean, how does it show up? It's not going to show up just out of the blue. It has to come from somewhere. So be very careful then in using your intention so that you are not overriding somebody else's free will. That's rule number one, or causing harm to somebody else. So a gray area here that is a really interesting one from an ethical point of view is, what if you want to stop somebody else from hurting somebody else? Well, you're overriding that person's free will because they're going to do whatever they're going to do. But if they're a bad person and they're going to hurt somebody else, the way that the magical traditions deal with this is to create a binding spell. There's lots of different names to it, but the binding spell essentially is an intention that the person will not produce harm to another person. And it's a gray area because you are interfering with them, but in a good way. That's why, from an ethical perspective, it's interesting to discuss, well, should you do that or not? I don't know, probably case by case, you have to decide, is this worth doing? And like, you have to eat the karma from that or not. So I don't have any simple answer to that, but that is a consideration.
Yeah, it's really interesting because I live in Latin America. I live in Colombia, and there's so much of that magical culture here. Like, people, instead of in the US, they would go to their therapist or their psychologist. People here go to their bruja, which is translation to witch in English. And it's a very gray area, as you said. I was only made aware of dark black magic very shortly ago because I've heard people's stories of what's happened to them, and they're not pleasant stories. So I also wanted to encourage, like have precaution around this. And I wanted to ask you, just as there would be what you called black magic, what would light magic look like in this case?
Generally, things like healing. Somebody is in need, gives you permission to heal them, because you don't want to, like, if somebody doesn't ask for your help, you should not give it to them, because that will it might be overriding their intention. Like some people say, don't deal with me at all. So don't do that. But if they're asking for help, then healing definitely is in the tradition of white magic, because you're helping. Or if it's simply that you're looking for information, like you want to make a decision about something, and it may or may not involve other people, but all you're asking for is information, that's okay as well. So, again, an interesting ethical issue is you want information because you want to know what stock to invest in. Well, it's not exactly gray. It's sort of in the white direction. But as you can see very quickly, the moment you think of magic as a kind of a power, whether it's divination or whatever it happens to be, power is seductive, and power will often be corrupting as well. So anyone who has talent in these domains immediately is encountering all kinds of questions, values, clarification questions, ethical questions about how do I use this?
Yeah.
And it's not always so easy to figure out how to use it.
Yeah. I wanted to just give a spoiler alert. If you haven't watched Doctor Strange, Madness in the Multiverse, stop listening to this podcast. Leave a rating first, leave a comment like this, and then go about your day, or come back, just skip a little bit. But I wanted to highlight what you just said about power being seductive, because in the Masters of the Far East, their goal has never been to attain these powers through meditation, but it's always like a outcome that just happens. Maybe after this we can get into like the Yoga Sutras that you talked about in your book Supernormal. But I just wanted to highlight that story of the Scarlet Witch, Wanda Maximoff in the Marvel comics. She attained this book, The Darkhold, and then her intention was she wanted to be in a reality where she could be with her children. But she attained this book and she started doing all these dark spells, and it corrupted her soul. So just like giving that example of what you're saying, and science fiction movies, there's always an underlying truth to what they're talking about. So I just wanted to highlight that. And to go even further around, like, people are asking, like, what type of powers are we talking about? If you could maybe get into the Yoga Sutras, the Siddhis that you talked about in that book.
Right. So my book Supernormal is about the Eastern esoteric traditions and the powers that result from meditation. My more recent book, Real Magic, is the same thing, but from a Western esoteric perspective, because all of these ideas ultimately come, there was no East and West, there was just one center of civilization, but it's split according to culture. So from the Western culture, magic consists of divination, knowing things about what's happening out there, force of will, which otherwise we thought it was psychokinetic effects, it's spell casting and so on, and then theurgy, which has to do with spirits, because all of the esoteric traditions assume that there are some kind of non-physical spirits out there. In the Eastern tradition, the same powers are thought about slightly differently, but they're called Siddhis, which is a Sanskrit term that means essentially power. It's the same kind of idea. Sometimes it could be translated as attainment, like special attainment, but it ultimately about different psychic abilities. So the Yoga Sutras is considered the classical book of yoga, written at least 2,000 years ago, but it was part of an oral tradition that goes back so far. We don't really know where it started from. And it was all about methods of meditation and deep states of mind, which they would call samadhi, which a magician would call gnosis. It's the same underlying deep mental state. That's where the magic comes from. That's where the siddhis come from, these deep mental states, which are generally, in most people, nowhere near a conscious level. It takes a lot of meditative experience or certain psychedelics to be able to drop into those states. So it's a non-ordinary state of awareness. The upshot is that from those deep states, it seems as though the difference between mind and matter, or everyday reality and some underlying sense of reality, is much more flexible than it is in your conscious awareness. So in the conscious awareness states, I want to levitate. It's not happening. Yes. In these deep states, it would happen because you're able to manipulate elements of reality that we don't have access to at this level of awareness. So there's roughly 25 different kinds of siddhis that are mentioned in these ancient texts. The most elementary ones are like the very first one that is mentioned is ability to perceive past, present, and future all at the same time. So today we'd call that somewhere between clairvoyance and precognition. And it goes all the way up to levitation, to invisibility, to super strength, to almost everything that you've seen in a comic book. But this was written thousands of years ago, not as a story, but as this will happen in these states. So from a modern perspective, you look back at that and say, well, this is so much like seeing a superhero movie that can't possibly be true. But there are historical cases of people levitating and doing all kinds of strange things that are mildly credible. We don't see those today in the laboratory. Like we have never seen anybody actually levitate. I'd love to.
Coming soon.
Well, maybe. So the idea is, so how do we evaluate the Yoga Sutras, given that it was so long ago? And the only way I can think of doing it then is saying, well, here's 25 or so different kinds of powers, simple elementary powers that many beginning meditators bump into are things like synchronicities and telepathy and clairvoyance and so on. We know those are real using modern scientific methods. So then the question would arise, well, if we know that roughly 6 to 10 of these 25 powers are real, were they simply making up the rest of them? I don't think so. I think that actually part of this lore that's been going on for probably tens of thousands of years, that people, probably a very small percentage of people, but some people can actually do those things. People who have those abilities are very likely not to want to be known for having those abilities, because they will immediately attract followers that they don't want, and they probably will put themselves and people they know in danger, right? Especially in the modern world, anybody who has that level of power will become a threat.
Yes.
And there will be people out there who want to get the threat to go away. And so someone with that level of skill almost certainly will remain invisible. It will be your neighbor, and you'll have no idea that they can do that.
And if they get discovered, they might get recruited to an advanced government. I'm referring to your joining of when you were part of the Stargate project in the U.S. government.
Right.
If you could tell us a little bit about that. I mean, there's highly advanced. So the remote viewing. Just I want to allow you to just explain and unwrap what that is and what type of projects they were doing within the U.S. government around that.
So remote viewing is a modern euphemism for clairvoyance. So perception through space and time. That's what the Stargate program was all about. And by the way, that was one code word of many different code words that were used over the years The idea was if someone really can perceive through space and time, it might be useful for espionage. And that's what that project was about. So there's two sides. One was a research program, which is what I was on. The other was an operational program that was part of an Army unit. So there were people who were recruited to be remote viewers. Some of them were naturally good. Others were interested and turned out that they could be trained. And they were given, I forget how many, 500 or 600 different missions, where their job was to use the remote viewing skills to give information to the intelligence community that would use the information as one piece of information, along with lots of other pieces of information. So in the intel business, you use satellites, you use human intelligence, you use everything you can think of to pull in information about a given event or thing that you want to know about. And then the analysts will kind of put it all together into a package. So I don't know of any cases where the psychic information was used only by itself. It was used as a composite. But sometimes the information was so unexpected that the analyst didn't know what to do with it. And it turned out to be true. Mm-hmm. So it turns out some people are quite talented at this. We had heard about and saw a couple of movies of people who were able to do small scale psychokinetic things. But by far, it was much, much easier to find people who are talented in clairvoyance. And that's so, if you think about what percentage of the population will have these skills. So something like 1 in 10,000 people will be quite good, just naturally at clairvoyance or be able to be trained somewhat. And maybe 1 in a million or fewer will have some kind of psychokinetic talent. So, if you have millions of people in the Army, you can do wide scale searching for people and recruit them and then keep sifting down candidates until you end up with a small number who are very good at what they do.
All this is so fascinating. And, I wanted to highlight for some people that they might be like, what is going on? Like, I don't know if I believe this. I don't know if this is scientific. And one thing I wanted to mention is that you said in your book that in almost any scientific discipline, the leading edge doesn't look like common sense at all. So this whole conversation, the work that you're doing is at the leading edge of science. Science is like catching up and it doesn't know everything. You even said it looks more like science fiction, which is what we're highlighting right now. And these stories, I really recommend. I haven't read the whole series because it's a long book series, but it's called The Life and Teachings of the Masters of the Far East. Mm-hmm. Recommended to me by a good friend. And, you read these stories about these yogis, enlightened masters that could walk through walls or by location, that they could appear in one point, their consciousness can appear in one point in the physical form and at the same time be at a different place at the same time. Mm-hmm. All of this is so fascinating. I'm like blown away by these topics and I can't wait. I wanted to know, what's your hope for science in the next 5 or 10 years that is catching up to all of these topics now?
Well, so first of all, there's lots of stories about what people can supposedly do. And so the value of science here is that in order to gain credibility about whether some of these stories are real, we need to figure out a way of bringing it into a controlled environment, generally in a laboratory, and use some kind of protocol to know what is chance and what is not chance, and to exclude all of the usual flaws that can look like something that's psychic but isn't. So the reason why we have high confidence that I would say elementary forms of telepathy and clairvoyance and precognition, some psychokinetic stuff, we know that's real because we can do the tests in the laboratory and others can repeat it. And then we publish our results. And this has been going on for over 100 years. So there's a lot of data showing that at least this elementary stuff is real. When you take that elementary stuff and you now push it, you elaborate it through historical records, through stories, things like that, very quickly you're taking the essence of what we know is real and expanding it up to the point where maybe people could not walk through walls. It's like a story that happens, or maybe they could. The point is we don't know because we haven't been able to study it under controlled conditions. So I'm just saying that when you're working at the edge of the known, it's very easy to forget that there's like a band of credibility. Like we're pretty solid. We understand how this works because we've tested it up the wazoo. And now we can imagine that these things, the rest of it might be true as well, but we don't know yet. So just, keep the spectrum clear.
Yeah. So
what I hope happens within the rest of science is, and it's not even a hope. I know that this is going to happen, that there's many, many people from students to faculty in universities around the world who are very interested in these things because it happens to them.
Yeah.
There's also a very severe constraint in the academic world that prevents it from happening because people don't want to be perceived as doing something too controversial or weird or whatever. I think that taboo is going to change. And the taboo is already changing, largely because over the past 30 years or so, the idea of studying consciousness as a topic of inquiry went from, this is ridiculous and only philosophers pay attention to it, up to the point where neuroscientists, physicists, biologists, lots of different disciplines are now really beginning to wonder how in the world is it possible for 3 pounds of neural tissue inside your head to give rise of the thing that you call me?
Yeah.
Like, well, how does that work? Well, the answer is at this point, no one has any idea how that works. We don't know. And so it becomes one of the top 10 or so major mysteries in science. And that, of course, becomes something that everybody wants to know. How does biology or matter turn into mind? So philosophers have been talking about this forever, but we're beginning to go into a stage which we can think of as experimental metaphysics. So the metaphysics here is a philosophical term, metaphysics, which has to do with the nature of reality. Yeah. So in physics, you find more and more physicists interested in what is the actual nature of reality itself. And a lot of that is being pushed by trying to understand what quantum mechanics is telling us about the nature of physical reality. So that trend is going to continue, finding more and more people interested in these kinds of foundational questions. And I already see signs that people are saying, well, I wonder if consciousness doesn't appear, like your experience doesn't appear to be physical. It's some sort of non-physical informational something or other. But it's here. It's like the only thing that we know for certain that is actually here is our own experience. Maybe it should be part of physics. If that's the case, how would we test that? Well, my answer is, the discipline of parapsychology has been testing this for 100 years. We actually know something about it. That's slowly going to be, the rest of science will begin to catch up and realize that these are testable questions with interesting answers that inform our understanding of what we mean by reality. And so I see that as a trend which is already apparent and will continue to be apparent. And all it takes for an academic anyway is just a tiny bit of courage to take that idea and turn it into something which sounds compatible with what they're doing, right? Yeah. I'm interested in consciousness. I'm interested in the foundations of quantum mechanics. I wonder if we can do this. And you put it into language that's not going to sound weird. And you do that study, and it's going to end up looking very much like what we would call psychic phenomena, because it's all about mind and matter and how they interact, but it'll have new language to it, which won't be quite as spooky.
Yeah. And Dean, I just wanted to tell you, you're one of the most courageous scientists in the world right now. I really admire the work that you're doing, because you're leading humanity to a new era. I wanted to read a quote that I read from you. It's if humanity has any chance of maturing beyond its barely controlled adolescence, we're going to need a much better understanding of what consciousness is and what it, by association, all of us are really capable of. And you said that consciousness is the glue that binds the fabric of reality. What do you mean by that?
I can think of reality as a kind of tapestry. So tapestry is made out of threads that interweave in many different directions. That tapestry is what science has studied, but the way that science works, if you look at the etymology of the word science, it means to cut. So we're taking this incredibly complicated and rich tapestry of reality, and cutting it into little pieces. That's what all our little disciplines are about. And we're learning a lot about the tapestry, but putting it all back together again is very difficult, because you need to know everything in order to see how it all fits together. So the reason why I like the kind of research that I do is because it's deep in the weeds, or it's in the threads of the tapestry itself, but it's always kind of looking at it from above, trying to figure out, how does you think of the warp and the weft, which are the two kinds of threads in the tapestry.
Yeah.
So I'm thinking of it as matter is definitely part of it, but mind is part of it too. They're interweaving in some complicated way that creates what we think of as reality. And parapsychology is one of the very few disciplines out there that is looking at both. It's looking at the relationship between the weave and the warp, or the threads in the tapestry of reality. And as I said in the quote that you said, I think it is probably true that we are adolescent primates, just barely controlled in many ways. We are ruining our house quickly, unfortunately. And so we had better become mature very quickly. And one of the ways of doing that is to figure out, well, who and what are we actually? What is the nature of reality? If our minds are wrapped into the nature of reality itself, which I think is the case, does it matter what we think? Does it matter what we collectively think about ourselves and the world? I think the answer is probably yes. There's a bit of evidence suggesting that it is yes. So we have to figure that out, because maybe there's a threshold, 10 billion people. We have to figure it out, or we're not going to be here anymore.
Yeah. What has been your biggest paradigm shift around consciousness since you started your research 40 years ago?
It was understanding that what we're actually studying is the nature of consciousness. So I remember very clearly, probably 20 years ago or more, that I was interested in telepathy and doing studies in telepathy. And a person at a conference was saying, ultimately, telepathy is really about what is the nature of consciousness. Like, how can I know in some way what somebody else's experience is? Which, again, it's not physical as best as we can tell. And we can trace everything from a photon into brain structure, into all of the physical parts of that, but that doesn't tell us anything about how you will experience it. So there's like an external world, there's a subjective internal world. They are interacting in some deep way. Science knows a lot about the external. We know very, very little about the internal. Go to the East, then you say, well, people have been meditating for 30 years. They know a lot about the internal world. And surprisingly, what they say is, you go deep enough, you end up in the external world. They're tightly correlated in some way. They're the same at some level, which is what all the esoteric traditions say, and is where the idea of magic comes from in the first place. You can manipulate reality. If you go into a state of subjectivity where the difference between subjective and objective completely dissolves. So from today's science, even today's philosophy to a large extent, and certainly at an everyday level of awareness, that sounds crazy. But that's where the evidence is pointing, both historically, anecdotally, and the bits of science that we know. Somehow reality is composed of mind and matter at the same time, and they are interacting all the time.
Yeah. What I love about you, Dean, is that you let your curiosity run wild. And I feel like that's something that younger people can be inspired by. That's also a big reason why I started this podcast, is because the curiosity aspect of it,
Yeah. So students are always asking, since students are always interested in this stuff, how can I do what you do? Well, at this point, since there's no career track, right, you can't go to the university and specialize in this as a topic. You, in a sense, have to become a kind of magician yourself, just like you're doing, right? You have high intention that you want to do something. And so my response then to a student is, find out what you're passionate about. It could be anything. It doesn't have to be this topic. It could be anything at all. Mm. Learn what your passion is, which may take a while because you have to try a bunch of things. Something you're going to be drawn to.
Yeah.
Figure out a way of spending your life doing that, because then you'll never work a day in your life.
Yeah.
right? So I'm driven by curiosity about the nature of everything. Like it's psychic phenomena is interesting, but I'm interested in lots of things. That's why I'm chairman of a biotech company. We're working on that too.
Yeah.
So I'm passionate about following my curiosity, and I don't work. I play every day.
That's amazing. And to begin wrapping up, Dean, we end every podcast with a segment called The Final Trio. It's just 3 rapid fire questions. Before that, I know you're doing so much in the world right now. You're doing experiments. Where would you send people to learn more about your work, and also what is going on right now in your life? What are some upcoming projects that you would like people to know about?
Well, so my website has most of my publications on it in a publications tab. So if they want to find out about what I've done, that would be the place to go. So you'll see the journal articles there, or my books, which are popular summaries of a lot of it. As far as what I'm doing now, I'm in the process of writing a grant, because most of the research that we do is covered by grants. And I'm working on a way to do a mind-matter interaction experiment at the level of photons. A lot of my work in the recent years has been mind-matter interaction at the photonic level, mainly because it's easy to show a relationship with quantum mechanics. Talking about the mystery in quantum mechanics as to why the way that you measure or observe something changes the quantum object's behavior, right? So that's purely quantum effect. You don't see that in the classical world at all. So I want to make a relatively inexpensive target system, because the ones we've been using range from $10,000 to $40,000. So that's out of the range of most people to test. So I'm looking at developing something that might cost $100, which would be at the range where people can, like almost anybody, can either build this thing or buy this thing if we ever decide to make it as a product, to do a mind-matter interaction experiment at the level of photons, particles of light. So part of this is out of an idea that citizen science is a growing trend, and a good one in this case, because if you have a lot of people want to test themselves in psychic things. So we have lots of a whole suite of tests online called gotsci.org, which has been running since 2000. It's, I forget, 6 or 8 different simple psi tests online. To date, we've collected 250 million trials from 1/3 people around the world.
Wow.
So we have a lot of data from that we've been slowly analyzing over the years. And then our new version just came out, and it's a lot faster and fancier than we had before, but it's at gotsci.org. So this is more, it's difficult to do tests that are online that are psychokinetic because you need a physical object. So all those tests are for psi perception. I'm thinking of here that I'm working on is a little thing which would be an interesting psychokinetic target, a physical object. So that's what I'm currently working on, besides everything else.
Yeah.
Papers and whatever.
We'll link everyone to what you just mentioned, and also the books. The books are incredible. I read Real Magic, and I read a little bit of Supernormal, and you have other 2 books. We'll link everything there. And now for the final trio, the first one that I wanted to ask you is, if you could attain and master a power, or Siddhi, as we've been calling it, in the universe, what would it be and why?
Well, first of all, if it was possible to have an unlimited number of wishes, that's the first thing. You always wish for an infinite number of additional wishes. The second wish is that you are wise enough to not wish for something that's going to harm yourself or anybody else. So that's the beginning of that sequence. After that, who knows what happens, but those 2 have to be set first. So if that's not possible, then just the other day I was thinking I would like to have the power to be able to speak any language for humans or animals, or actually anything, to understand language or communication from all sentient creatures. Maybe even like a tree. Is a tree speaking? Well, kind of. It has language of its own kind. And this came about partially because when we travel overseas, we're hearing lots of people talking different languages, I want to be as adept in those languages as I am in English, and to be able to speak those languages as a native.
Yeah.
So I thought, as of various powers, if I don't get my first power, because if I got the first power, that would be one of the wishes that I would add on.
Yeah.
So yeah.
Well,
if you're only allowed one, I would have the language one.
Whenever you need some starting help with Spanish, I got you.
So I'm using Duolingo to learn a language, but I'm starting with not Spanish. My wife is doing Spanish.
Qué bien, me alegra. The second question is, I watched this talk that you recommended by Mitch Horowitz, ESP Case Closed. So we know that extrasensory perception is real now. Like, I think the skeptics, they're just right now they're being a little bit arrogant with what they're saying, because the evidence is there. But for some of the things that we might not have complete evidence or certainty for, which of those would you want to break the paradigm on in the next coming years?
It would be mind-matter interaction. You see, a case can be made that what looks like perception, like clairvoyance, is purely passive and perceptual, right? But it is kind of a mind-matter interaction, because you're getting information from somewhere else that's somehow impinging into you and you experience it. Well, maybe it's not matter. It might be mind information interaction. It's not entirely clear how that works. But I'm talking specifically about, here is a metal bar. I want my mind to make this thing just go bloop and fall over. We don't know how to do that yet, although somewhere around here. Yeah. So
magicians have been bending spoons for a long time.
Yeah. And there are plenty of ways of doing that. But this one I did for real.
Oh.
Right. So this is a...
Wait, hold on 1 second. Spoon. If you're on audio, Dean is showing us a bent spoon, literally, that he did with his mouth.
Well, not just bent, but the bowl is bent in half. So if you take a soup spoon and you figure out how much force is necessary to bend the bowl, and the bowl is very hard to bend because of the shape, the shell shape, a human cannot do this unless you're like a muscle man or something. Yeah. I don't have enough strength to do that. But I did do that. And I had the presence of mind to check, like, am I damaging my fingers in doing this? Or do I have like super adrenaline or something? No. I was in a context where people were trying to do this. So I was going along with the game. And I surprised myself a lot. I didn't think it was possible to do this until I did it myself. So
how long did it take you to do that?
Oh, seconds.
Seconds.
No, I mean, I've been paying attention to somebody else that said she was able to do this, and I was paying very close attention, kind of sort of mimicking what she was doing with it. And then someone said to me, "Look what you've done." I didn't even realize I'd bent it about halfway, and I looked at it in amazement, and they said, "Go keep pushing it," and I did, and it ended up there, and it's been there ever since.
Wow.
So I have lots and lots of magical tricks, including things like memory metal and things where you can fake it. This is not fake. That's real. So immediately you think about, well, this is a macroscopic psychokinetic effect. We don't know how that happens, but it does happen. Well, so that suggests what we look at in the lab, like if we're mentally influencing photons, maybe that's easier because it involves much less force, and a photon's only quasi-material to begin with. I think that is probably true. Because this sort of thing is not that unusual. You find people who claim to do it. But we've never been able to capture this in the laboratory. That's one of the reasons why I don't use this as evidence of just for me. It's like it influenced me, but I wouldn't expect anybody else to even believe it, because I know from my own colleagues that I did not believe it before I did it myself. So I want to be able to get to the point where we understand enough about what goes on in these macroscopic cases to be able to give enough explanation so it doesn't sound completely insane. Because at this point, it is kind of insane, right? So I have lots of different kinds of metal bars. This one's pure copper, and this one's a kind of aluminum, and so on. Where in principle, you should be able to do that with this. I don't know how to do it with this, but that's that's where I'd like to go.
Yeah. And I just wanted to quickly, this is something I learned recently, and it goes along the power of the mind, the power of belief. And we've heard people say, like, I'll see it when I believe it.
Yeah.
And it's like, oh no, people say I'll believe it when I see it outside.
Right.
But inverting that, it's like, when I believe it, I will see it.
Right. Although, you see, before I did this, I didn't think this was possible. So I was about as skeptical as you can imagine, because I always dealt with extremely low levels of matter and energy in these experiments. This is not low level anymore. This is a thing in the physical world. And so I reassessed after doing that. Friends of mine who said that they were able to do that with rebar. So if you take a rebar and bend it, well, a strong man can do that, but even then, it's not always real rebar. It's softened in the middle. This is actual rebar, which they somehow bend. Well, that shouldn't be possible, because we know how much torque it takes in order to do that, and that something is happening. Fortunately, it doesn't happen all the time, because the denouement of the story involving this spoon is I had another spoon just like it, and I was flying home and trying to bend the other spoon. And I suddenly got this sort of a horrific thought that I have no idea how I was able to bend the first spoon. Well, maybe it's a field effect, and it's softening all of the metal around me, and I'm in an airplane, and I don't want the airplane wings to suddenly get soft, because they'll fall off. So there's the cautionary tale there, right? We're working with something that's quite real, in this sense was quite powerful, and that it did something strange with metal. And if we don't know what we're doing, you have to be very careful with it. So when it comes to things like telepathy and clairvoyance, it's more difficult to imagine how that could be dangerous, but this could be dangerous. Yeah. And so, I don't want to end up being like Mary Curie and discovering radium and dying from that at the same time. Yeah. So that's always a part of the challenge and the fun and the danger of working at the leading edge.
And at science, it's like that example of the 4-minute mile. When you start seeing people do it, and it's imprinting, as your colleague Rupert Sheldrake says, it's imprinting it into the morphic field. It's like now the collective consciousness of humanity accepts that as a reality, and it'll be normalized. So I think that's what you're doing, your work is doing, and I highly, highly appreciate your work for that. And the final question, I know we've taken a bit more of your time, but it's that closing statement for the future generation of leaders, of scientists, of world changers, of researchers that will inherit this new science. What advice or closing statements? I hope it's not the closing statement, because I would love to do this again. But what would that closing statement be for now?
As Joseph Campbell once said, follow your bliss. Provided that whatever makes you blissful is not hurting somebody else, follow your bliss. Which, of course, means you have to find out what your bliss is first, and then do that.
I love that.
If you can, right? I mean, not everyone, if you have a family and responsibilities and stuff, you may be in a job where you don't particularly blissful about, but then your family can be your bliss, right? So you do whatever is necessary to find out what gives you that sense of aliveness and meaning and purpose. Do that.
Yeah. Dr. Dean, this has been a fascinating conversation, for real. Thank you so much for all your time, for the work that you're doing in the world right now, and for your courage. I really, really admire that.
Yeah, a word about courage here. I'm not particularly courageous, right? I mean, I could see how it would be perceived from a distance. It's more that the process of wanting to know who and what we are, that's always driven me. I've always been interested in that. And I come from a family of rebels, essentially. People who were never satisfied with the status quo, an artistic family. So I was taught from a very early age that just trying to fit in with the status quo, it's like the most boring thing in the world. Why would you ever want to do that? Life is short. Do something creative and new if you can, right? And if you can't, because as I said, you have other responsibilities, you find some way of doing something it gives you this thrill of being creative.
Yeah. And the people that go against the status quo are the ones that change the world, and we've known this for all of history. So thank you so much. Thank you so much for the work you do. I highly appreciate it.
Thank you.